Hello and welcome to another Helpful Tech vid. In this video we're going to go over virtual hosting on a CentOS machine. Basically what I have here is the CentOS machine I installed in a previous video off of a net install, and all I've done to this thus far is a yum update to update the packages, and I also copied over the index files and CSS files of the Ubuntu virtual host video that I did, because there's no real point in reinventing the wheel. All those are your standard HTML and CSS files. It doesn't really have anything to do with the configuration of the server. What I will be doing is copying and pasting the virtual host definitions out of the configuration file from that server to this one, however, as it basically doesn't change very much. But we'll go through a specific one, and then the copying and pasting is mainly just to save me from data entry and reinventing the wheel, so to speak. So all you really have to do is just fill in the blanks. Yours are going to be different than mine anyway, for the most part, because your server is going to be hosting actual files, and this is just kind of like a dummy setup. They're not publicly accessible on the internet. First off, if you haven't had this installed yet, you'll want to go check out that video of installing CentOS, either with the full-on CD, the gambit of CDs, the gambit of DVDs, or using the net install method, which is what I did on that video. So the first thing that you want to do once you have an up and running CentOS machine is do a yum install HTTPD. And that is Apache 2. I couldn't tell you why the RPM-based distributions such as CentOS and Red Hat refer to it as HTTPD, but it is Apache. So you'll hit yes there, it'll download and install the packages. And then there's a couple extra things to CentOS that differ from Ubuntu. First off, CentOS comes with IP tables, which is a firewall enabled by default, and it also comes with SE Linux enabled by default. So we want to disable those two features. So how you disable SE Linux is nano etc sysconfig SE Linux. And a lot of admins will probably immediately go, oh, I don't want to do that. In this particular video, I'm trying to show you how to set up virtual hosting with Apache, and if you don't necessarily want to disable SE Linux or IP tables, but just allow those ports through, a quick Google search, I'm sure, will show you how to do that. It's not really relevant to the scope of this video to explain how to set up SE Linux and IP tables to accept the incoming connections on port 80. So to disable it, or if you just want to disable it temporarily and then go back, re-enable it, and get all of that set up, you just do a nano etc sysconfig SE Linux and come down to this SE Linux line here and change this to disabled. And then you can do a service IP tables stop and check config IP tables off. And the stop will turn off IP tables for this boot instance. The check config IP tables off will turn it off for future boot instances. So if you want to enable it again, you just do a check config IP tables on. So now it's disabled. So that's great, but we do want to do a reboot after those steps. So I'm going to reboot, and when it comes back up, I'll resume the video. Okay, now we're back up here. So now what you do is you go into cd etc httpd conf, and your httpd.conf file is the equivalent of your apache2.cfg file, if that's what you're used to using. So if I go into that and take a peek, you'll notice that we have some things down here at the bottom. And this is generally, I mean, you could include a separate file and have your virtual host configurations defined in there, and that's perfectly fine. That'll work for you. But in this particular instance, I'm just going to define the virtual hosts right here in this file. But in order to activate virtual hosts, what we want to do is uncomment that line and have just the name virtual host *:80 enabled. And if we do a Control X there, Oh, I'm sorry, there's one other thing that we need to do is if we go to document root, well, this is particular to my setup, but if we find the document root, there was apparently a change in Apache where the document root now points everything at var www html. I'm going to backspace out that /html because I want the var www folder to be the root of everything. Kind of legacy, I guess, if that's what you want to call it. It's just the way I'm used to seeing it. And you also want to change this last one here, directory, if you're doing it my way. Otherwise, you just create subfolders under the HTML directory. So I'm going to close that, save it, and do a service httpd restart. And it's going to, yeah, it has no virtual hosts, and we need to create those. So I'm going to go back to my root folder here, and I have this tar folder, this tar file that I've extracted, and there's the etc and var commands, or folder structures from the other machine that I had set up. So I'm just going to go in here and copy the test A and test B to var www. Sorry, I have to throw a recursive in there. And we want to do that for B, and we also want to do port 81. And then we go back to root, and I take a look at my etc Apache 2 sites available default, and I'm just going to copy from here on out into that folder, or that comp file. Go all the way to the bottom and paste it in. And then the other thing that you want to do, if you're doing this with me, I'm doing this last one as port 81, so you do have to tell Apache to listen on port 81, and we can do that by a Control W while in this comp file and search for the listen, and then we just add a second line here, listen 81. Control X, save, and restart. And notice that it doesn't throw the error anymore that it did before. Name virtual host *80 has no virtual host. That is not here anymore. So I've already changed my host file to point to the appropriate IP address, bind the domains to the appropriate IP address. Let's see if I can paste that up here. So I know the IP address of this machine is 10.120, so I've already made all my bindings. This is actually the same host file from my Ubuntu video. So this one's irrelevant and this one's irrelevant. But you do want these if you're following along with me, just as a template. And I'll save that. And now if I come over here and go to testa.com, I get brought to testa.com. If I go to testb.com, I get taken to testb.com. Also, if I do a www.testa.com, I get taken to testa. And then if we go to port81.com, it'll take us to testa.com, just like in the previous video, and that's because by default, if you go, let me pull it up here, if you go to if you visit the server and it doesn't match the specified asterisk, which would stand for an IP address, and port number, it will by default take you to the first defined virtual host, which in my case is testa, and that's exactly what happened. The reason being is I went to port81.com, but I told Apache to only listen for port81.com on port 81. So that's why it loaded up testa, is because it didn't, when the request came in, it didn't match all of the criteria. The asterisk simply meaning any IP address, but then the stipulation is port 81. And you do want Apache to load up a site by default. So you could enter another virtual host in here for the IP address on there and have it send to a different one if you like, or if you like the default one, you can leave the default one. You can also rearrange these as you see fit. You could put, this guy on as the first defined virtual host, and it'll load up testb.com by default. And that's what happens if you hit the IP address directly as well. is it's going to take you to the first defined virtual host, say testa.com. So for port 81, what I do is I do port81.com:81, and that's specifying a different port than the default. Default is 80, of course. So if I go there, well, that shouldn't have happened. Port81.com:81. Why isn't that working? It doesn't seem to be listening to my hosts file. Let me try www. It's not listening to my host file. Alright, so troubleshooting step here, what you can do is get out of here and do a netstat-ano grep 81. And what that's going to do is it's going to list all of the machine's ports that it's listening on, and then with the pipe grep 81, I am searching specifically for 81. And it does show that it's listening. And one other thing that I can do is on a separate machine, I can do a nmap of that IP address, and that will show me all of the listening ports that it has available. And let's just make sure that it's listening for external connections as well. And it looks like it is. So let me try this. Oops. Alright, I'm going to pause and troubleshoot really quick. It seems to be an issue with Internet Explorer, something overriding it perhaps, but Firefox and Chrome seem to function just fine. Yeah, port 81. Yeah, and that loads up port81.com, and if I go there directly, it loads up testa without specifying the port 81. So if you want to run a web server, for example, on a non-standard port, what you would want to do is some sort of Apache proxying, which is out of the scope of this video, or establish an SRV record for that particular domain, also outside of the scope of this tutorial. But I think we've successfully managed to demonstrate virtual hosting within CentOS. It's essentially the same thing as Ubuntu, just a couple of different file paths. The package name is different for whatever reason. Again, I couldn't tell you why that is. And then also you would want to look into enabling incoming connections on the necessary ports, whether it be 80 or 81 or whatever port you specify within IP tables. So hopefully that makes some sense to you guys. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment. I would appreciate a comment, like, subscribe, share, whatever your social media allows you to do, and we will catch you on the next video.